Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Micere Keels here with us this morning. Dr. Keels is an associate professor in comparative human development at the University of Chicago. She focuses on understanding how race, ethnicity, and poverty structure the supports and challenges that children and youth experience. And so we're very excited to welcome her here on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. Dr. Keels will be speaking about stepping outside the diversity box for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Once we get to the Q&A portion, feel free to unmute yourself or drop your questions in the chat. And with that, Dr. Keels, we're looking forward again to welcome you and hearing what you have to tell us about stepping outside the diversity box.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for inviting me, and happy to be here with you guys in this remote space. So even though, we traditionally leave questions to the end, I am just say that I'm really okay and often invite questions throughout when they, as things might come up. They can either be clarifying questions, or it can be a moment for questions about how do we put something into practice. I am actually going to start, if I can ask you guys really quickly in the chat, just to share what your roles are, because that helps me as I'm thinking about things as I'm going along as we're talking. So just like really quick, what your role at the university is. Oh, excellent. Just a really broad group. This is great. So this means that we will have really robust discussion and conversation. And like I said, I'm okay with it going periodically throughout, as well as at the end. And I might pause and ask, and sometimes pause, stop the sharing, and bring us all kind of back into this screen where we can see each other's pictures and virtually, and ask for some reactions and things like that as we're going along. So let me share my screen and get started and see, and also put my timer on. Okay, so as noted, the title is Stepping Outside the Diversity Box. And large part is kind of will become clear as we go through this. That title is because we kind of really focus on the numbers in many ways as institutions with what we do when we're thinking about diversity. And we focus a lot on recruitment and getting them admitted, getting them on campus, and seeing what our numbers are. And this is kind of saying that as students are telling us that we need to think beyond that and think about multiple dimensions of how they experience diversity and actually inclusion on campus. And so that's where we're trying to go with this. And so it starts by kind of noting, as I said, that the numbers drive everything. It can be two types of numbers. It can be actual, like just numbers of enrollment of students, but that enrollment of students is actually often driven by financial considerations behind that enrollment for why the push for diversity has increased as the American population has changed, as financial pressures, enrollment pressures are hitting the university. And so while we are in a context today where many universities do enroll cohorts that are much more diverse than they were in the past, it's really important to look more deeply into that enrollment, and also think about whether once we get students on campus, how are we changing as an institution, adapting and growing as an institution to think about well-being, which then affects persistence, particularly for students from historically marginalized groups. And I always kind of start this by getting a better picture of the institution when I'm doing these types of talks. And so what we're going to look at is some data from Rutgers. And it starts with this quote, which is that administrators often view diversity as a generalized characteristic of institutions and can be blind to the particular circumstances of the racial and ethnic groups that constitute the diversity on that campus. So this is 2019, before the pandemic. Pandemic, I'm sure, has disrupted quite a bit of maybe what the campus diversity looks like. And it's going to take some time, a couple of years, to see how things might shift. So this was 2019, fall of 2019, and the campus composition of these really broad groups based on kind of like the iPad's statistical data of universities. There are, of course, some small groups that are not included in these broad numbers. If we look back 25 years, 1994 to 2019, just like this broad look, we see that there has been a huge shift on campus. And sometimes, and also I know there's lots of mobility of the administrative staff on campus. And so what an institution looks like right now and the administrators' awareness, though, of the history of change on that campus might not be there. So an institution might look a particular demographic composition right now, but it's really important to think about how did it look in its recent past to maybe understand what's happening. And so when we look at this distribution, we see that there has been a huge shift in these two groups, which could, as we'll talk about in a bit, lead to increase in diversity conflict across these two groups of students, because there's this sense, there's a dislodging of the position of those two broad groups on campus. And so there might be a recent history, memory, and sense in that kind of college community when we're particularly thinking about alumni, legacy, admissions, and many things like that, that this flip could affect how those two groups of students broadly interact and engage with each other. And then also when we look at this number down here, we see that there's actually been a relative decrease in terms of, it's small, but it's a relative decrease in terms of their composition on the campus as other groups have shifted over this recent history. And so it's also thinking about what's been the recent shift, demographic shift, what does it look like now? And what is the coming demographic shift? And how do all of those things together affect the way students engage and interact with each other across racial and ethnic boundaries? And although I'm talking and focusing on racial and ethnic boundaries in this discussion, this really applies to many different aspects of the campus. It can apply to religious affiliation. When we did the campus survey at my university, I insisted that we asked about racial and ethnic, how students identify themselves based on racial and ethnic characteristics, based on religious affiliation, based on gender identity, really broadly categorized, and also based on sexual affiliation and orientation, in order to think about multiple categories of identity diversity that can affect how the campus has shifted and how students engage with each other. We then looked at each one at a time. And so that's just to say that it's important to think that there probably have been other shifts in the composition of students where it matters to think about how that has changed over time. So we're going to focus, though, on the high risk opportunity that's being created for Black and Latinx students. And when I say high risk opportunity, this is thinking about coming demographic pressures. So what I know some schools are concerned about and thinking about right now is how international students is shifting as a source of the campus student population, and how that is leading to pressures for more and increased recruitment among Hispanic, and Latinx and Black students in the US. And so that is a potential high risk opportunity, because what we know currently right now is that that means recruiting more first generation, more lower income students, more students that don't have a history, a family history, community history of success in these institutions. And those are also often students that are taking on more debt and come to the institution with more challenges that could affect their persistence. And so, and recruiting and admitting them is creating an opportunity, but it's a high risk opportunity if they don't persist and graduate. And that is because these students are more likely to also be low wealth students that can't afford the risk of taking on student debt without also graduating in order to ensure that they are earning that higher income and higher salary to be able to service and pay off that debt. So we have, some good research on the likelihood that students will pay off debt versus default. And students who graduate have a very high likelihood, it may take a while, but they have a very high likelihood of paying off their debt. And it's the students who don't persist all the way through to getting their degree. Those are the ones who have a very high likelihood of default. And so we really need to think about, as we are creating this opportunity for historically marginalized students, what are we doing to make sure that we are attending to them persisting all the way through to graduation? Because for a low wealth student to, even if they're only attending 1 year before dropping out, that 1 year of student debt can be crippling for an individual. So it's really critical to think that for all the students from historically marginalized groups that we might enroll, recruit, enroll, and admit into our institutions, what are we doing to ensure that they are going to persist? And so this is kind of like that old leaky pipeline analogy that we use for many of these things. And so we usually spend a lot of time thinking about this part of the pipeline. And there's a particular reason, so we think a lot about, well, we don't, but a lot of institutions think about, how do we get them to graduate? So how do we ensure that the students are going to be there for us to be able to recruit into our institutions? And so that's kind of access to college preparatory curriculum, access to college counselors, culturally competent college counseling, and having a college educated family and social network. And all of those things kind of affect the likelihood that students in high school are not going to have the portfolio and track record that are going to enable them to be admitted into our institution. But so even if they kind of get through that part of the pipeline, how is our, as higher ed institutions, how are our application review and admissions processes? Who is dropping out who's falling out of the pipeline due to what's happening at that part? And then like the really huge unmet financial need. So there's just a large percentage of those students who they've met all those criteria, but because of what they can cobble together and what is being offered in aid, that unmet financial need, again, is another place where they fall out the pipeline. But we do all of those things, everything happens, we actually enable enrollment for historically marginalized students. But what are we doing at our institution once they're there to really foster the highest level of persistence possible? And that's where we're thinking about many of these things in this talk. So differentiated transition supports. So are we differentiating our orientation and how students are acclimated to the institution based on whether or not they have a history of like kind of a family and cultural and social network, and many other things like that. So culturally relevant guidance once they get to campus. What messages are they receiving from their advisors that are helping them thinking about and making decisions around course taking and all of those types of things? I talk about a bunch of these different things in the book. Financial distress and work hours, that is a huge one, because many students from historically marginalized groups don't need to think about just themselves. They also need to help and support families back home. The climate for diversity and inclusion, culturally relevant courses. So many students report that they're in classrooms where they feel completely alienated from the content because they don't see or hear anything that indicates or takes into account different cultural perspectives for how to think about this academic content. And of course, at the end, we have those who finally persist through to graduation. But just to think that there are many points in this pipeline, and we don't pay as much attention to the persistence pipeline, part of the pipeline. And I'm taking it off because, just to make a point, is there's research that shows that institutions spend most of their kind of minority recruiting and diversity recruiting in these areas. And that's in part because they're constantly replacing students, having to do high levels of this recruitment enrollment to replace diverse students who don't persist and leave. And the research shows that if they spent a little bit more of that budget on enabling and facilitating persistence, that the payoff is much higher than continually having to recruit students to, in part, have a high recruitment in order to account for the attrition that's going to happen along the persistence part of the pipeline. And so the summary there is kind of really thinking about it from the student's perspective, though, which is that without reform, one downside of diversifying higher education will be that increasing access to a degree quickly becomes increasing access to unmanageable student debt for some of our most vulnerable youth. So we really need to think about what is the opportunity that we're creating. And it's not just the opportunity to enroll at the institution. So kind of moving on a little bit and just thinking about, we have these students, we've enrolled them, we've got them here on campus. What is it? What's our goal once we have them here on campus? And I really want to clarify some terms that often get interchanged in incorrect ways. So we're going to start about saying kind of where students might be, students, staff, and faculty actually at this point in time when we're thinking about Black and Latinx students in particular, which is that legal barriers to enrollment has been dropped. Substantial numbers of students have accepted and enrolled. When we think about, way in past in the history of these institutions, policies have been written to tell members of the campus community what forms of speech and behaviors will not be tolerated, as well as what forms of hurtful speech are protected. Those things were okay to get us to where we are now, but what the campus community is now saying is that these advances were good for a time, but students, staff, and faculty from historically marginalized groups are now asking their institutions to move beyond diversity and tolerance toward full inclusion. So diversity, that's the who is on campus. How many of individuals from which groups? That's our statistical, that's our recruitment. Tolerance, that's a lot of what institutions have been doing. Really focusing on making clear and enforcing what one can and cannot legally say and do, with regard to the hate and hostility that targets members of legally protected groups, which was critical and important. But how are we doing with inclusion? How can we foster and leverage interpersonal interactions among and across a broad range of status and identity groups to strengthen campus belonging for all students? So when we look at these in terms of thinking about what our goals are, diversity goals, that's again, like that's the recruitment. How can we remove barriers to enrollment? How can we get them here? When we're thinking about our tolerance goals, that's like policies that can be legally enforced. How can we increase student, faculty, and staff awareness of their rights and responsibilities? That's kind of all of those trainings, all of those informational meetings and things like that. Inclusion can't be legally mandated in the way that students, staff, and faculty need to experience it. Inclusion, that's about building the skills necessary for faculty to create and engage students in diverse learning environments, and creating opportunities that enable individuals from historically marginalized groups to see themselves and their culture represented in the constellation of old and new traditions that comprise the institution's culture. So it's really critical that we're separating diversity, tolerance, and inclusion, and really asking ourselves, what are we doing along the diversity side? What are our diversity goals? And how are we meeting those? Where are we with tolerance? And how are we attending to inclusion at the end of the day? And we talk a little bit about maximizing inclusion, and then seeing if anybody has any moment for discussion or questions before kind of going on. So I think this is a really helpful statement. Inclusion implies that someone has been excluded at some point in time and prevented from full participation in a community that they desire to access. This is important because this tells us that inclusion, again, it's not just about bringing them to campus physically. It's not just about admitting and enrolling students from historically marginalized groups. If you feel, if you have that sense, if you know that you have been excluded in the past, you come with a sense of concern and trepidation about belonging. So you are coming to campus with bringing all of those feelings with you, and you need the institution to kind of very intentionally show you that things are different now, and very intentionally communicate belonging. So many institutions, I find, kind of say, well, we admitted them, we enrolled them, we brought them here. And with the idea that by simply doing that, students should then, from historically marginalized groups, should walk into the institution feeling an automatic sense of belonging because they have been admitted, which is what students from majority groups that don't have that history of exclusion, they do. All they need oftentimes is to be admitted to the institution formally. And once they have that admission, they take that kind of piece of paper and they confidently walk in. Other students in historically marginalized groups don't. They walk in very concerned and expecting to experience rejection. And so it takes intentional work to shift that. I want to talk about some dimensions of inclusion then that can be helpful in terms of thinking about what we're doing. One is the communications dimension. And so what is the truth and integrity in communicating historical harms? Is the institution open about its history of exclusion? And does it center equity in its statements about the future? And where this comes from is the sense that what students were saying is, to what extent do we have to dig up and the institution's history around these things. When we ask for information around these things, do we get any information? Do we see anything in the institution, in its language, in its documents that acknowledges that very often recent histories of harm, and acknowledges that the diversity that you see on campus now is new, and it's not all long-standing. It hasn't always been this way. And when they ask questions, when student groups ask questions, when student groups probe for more, are they hit with a kind of an informational kind of wall where they can't get information, and where they have to, many have kind of sued their own institutions to try to get information? That's happening at mine, where students had to really fight to dig up and get information in order to understand its history. And that matters. So when students want more, want to know the very recent history, can they get that? And is that recognized in any of the communication, or does everything kind of communicate that everything is wonderful now? The policy and practice dimension. Does inclusion live only in statements? And the way that I kind of ask administrators to think about this is that, to what extent, when you look at documents or speeches and things that make claims about diversity and inclusion at the institution, do those claims actually connect to specific policies, programs, or practices? Or do they live only as statements? And this is something that we heard quite a lot from students when we were interviewing. And they really got angry about this aspect of kind of hearing so much about diversity and hearing so much about inclusion, but knowing from their experiences at the institution that it didn't live in statements. It didn't live in practice. And they were like, I would be happier if my institution said less and communicated less about diversity and inclusion, given the fact that these things aren't living in policies, programs, and practices, than them saying as much as they are, but having these things not live in practice. And that disconnect actually made them quite angry and frustrated about their institutions and around hearing kind of diversity speeches and statements, and being oftentimes that disconnect intensified their level of anger about these issues.
Can we ask questions?
Yep, we can. I'm happy to pause.
So I'm so sorry to
No, I'm actually, like I said, I invite it. I'm okay with it. Tell me when there's a question.
Oh, awesome. I'm enjoying your talk. My question is when on your last comment where you mentioned that students would get angry because they were tired of basically lip service. So my question is, did they give examples in terms of how they would, in their ideal world, what would living the practice look like for them?
So living the practice meant, and I'm happy to use, thankful I'm in a space where so this is also something that it was 2016 when we did our campus climate survey at my institution, and I directed that survey. And one of the things that I learned from that was a huge eye-opener for me, because I'm a tenured faculty member, is that the most vulnerable individuals on our institution in terms of their feeling of vulnerability around many of these things were staff, because they're not students, who the institution's serving. They're not tenured faculty where we have some protection. Staff have very little protection in terms of their ability to speak up around these different things, and potentially have negative consequences coming from that speaking up. And I just say that because what I was about to say is I can use my institution as an example for some of these things when we're talking about this gap between statements and living that practice. So at my institution, for example, one of those things is after the murder of George Floyd, our institution put out several statements regarding just regarding their commitment to diversity, their commitment to change. And one that was particularly distressing for many was a Juneteenth celebration email and support email that was sent out. And the students were just like, but we don't experience belonging on our campus and in a way that connects with this, and particularly with the Juneteenth, because there was a set of graduate students in the history department that did research and work, and they spent some considerable time doing this around the very early historical money trail that founded the institution, and to what extent was any of that connected with slavery. And they experienced a lot of that informational wall from the institution, trying to understand the history, trying to understand, examine those things. And this was done a few years before George Floyd's murder. But they had done all that work and they put a report together. And there was complete silence from the institution in response to that report that these students did. And so then when the institution put out this email celebrating Juneteenth and its support for Juneteenth and its support for making that a national holiday and all of those things, that is where an example of kind of that, but you're saying this, but you're doing this. And it is, the silence was frustrating and it was upsetting to them, but then it was making statements about Juneteenth that kind of, it just fueled the anger, because again, like the student said, I'd rather you be silent than put out these supportive statements that are not connected to our experience. That increases our anger even more. Yes.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Sorry, I'm having problems with my camera, but that is very helpful.
No problem. Yeah, thank you for asking. So the next one is the academic dimension. So intentional and deliberative decolonization of the curriculum. Does I can't say the word today. So does diversity in the curriculum occur primarily only in ethnic studies courses, or does it occur across the institution? So, and the way to think about this is to what extent, so if I'm a student that's a bio major or chemistry major, or, you know, computer science major, or many others, is my academic life, if I am, you know, a historically marginalized student in one of those majors, is my academic life one where those contributions of scholars who come from my background, do I get to see them at all in my curriculum? Do I even get to know that they exist and there are people, individuals of my cultural background that have made contributions in these spaces? Generally, we find that it's only in particular sub-social science disciplines or some humanities disciplines and some political science space where students are able to take courses that both enable them to kind of see themselves in the curriculum and meet academic requirements. And to what extent is the primary work that I'm doing at this institution, being a student and taking classes, is that something that is completely devoid of any kind of cultural connection to individuals of diverse backgrounds? And so those students have to get those experiences and those connections in other ways and in other spaces. And it adds to the work that they have to do, because they can't get those experiences and those connections in the primary space that they're supposed to experience when they come to a university. And then lastly, the social dimension. So informal social interactions that cross racial and cultural boundaries. Are non-academic spaces socially segregated? And the quick example that I'll give there, it's in the book, and it always makes me kind of laugh, where I asked kind of about these issues, and we asked about this in all of our interviews, social integration. And, one student was just like, what are you talking? Many students were like, what are you talking about? Yes, of course, the campus is segregated. And one student was like, well, I don't know. And most of them were kind of like, I don't know what these administrators are talking about. And one student kind of said, yeah, I don't know what these administrators are talking about when they say the things that they say regarding kind of like integration on campus. They're like, anybody, you just go and sit outside. This one student was talking about a food hall. Just go and sit outside the food hall for one day, half a day. And so, like, you'll see if in the morning, a particular group, racial ethnic group comes in and they're in this kind of space and they dominate that space for this period of time, around this other time, then you see the Black students come in. As you see them come in, you see the other students move out. And then in another period of time, these students from another racial ethnic group will start to come in and go over into another space. And then those will exit out. But all of them really said, these things are easy to see on campus if any administrator cares to look and notice. You can get a clear sense of just how segregated campus is. So I want to share just what the diversity bargain is, and then ask for any comments and thoughts. So the diversity bargain is the idea that American universities embarked on a diversity push without a plan for how to make diversity work, especially regarding the increasing conflict that is inherent in increasing diversity. So increasing diversity means increasing conflict, particularly from perceived reverse discrimination, which is the discomfort that comes from feeling that one's assumed privileged position or perspective is no longer the standard. And what I want to ask is, to what extent has anybody been doing any work in terms of thinking about conflict? Has there that expectation that as we increase diversity, it increases conflict across student groups? Was that an expected aspect of what would happen with increased diversity as we push? And any thoughts about just that idea that it is a natural and expected outcome of increasing diversity?
So I'll jump in to get us started. I don't know, sort of, if I think about myself personally, and even some of the research that I had done, if I had necessarily thought about it being like a natural outcome, though it does sort of seem obvious. But I will also say one of the things that we launched this year is actually a Speak Up campaign to try to get to that shared understanding of like, how can you disrupt conflict or disrupt bias when you see it? So I do feel like there is attention to the ways in which when you do become more diverse, it does create conflict. And so what do we do? How do we give people skills to like disrupt it when it's happening? And so I think that is one campus level effort to get at it.
And let me add in here, as you guys are thinking, I don't think, and many researchers and folks that think about this, I think the conflict is good. The increased diversity creating increased conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. The fact that increased diversity is going to create increased conflict is not in and of itself a bad thing. The question was around, one of the things that we know is that more homogeneous context, whatever identity measure you want to use, the more homogeneous the individuals are, the less conflict there is. As you increase diversity, as diversity increases, interpersonal conflict increases. It's a natural outcome of increasing diversity. And how do we think of that, given the roles of many of the people in here, when you're pushing for increased diversity on campus?
I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, like the idea that conflicts that results from increased diversity is not like inherently a bad thing. If you could, yeah, I would just be interested in hearing more about that, because I do think it's a useful reframe. And I also see that Genevieve has her hand raised as well.
Yes, I'm gonna get Genevieve talk first, and then Glenda.
Sure thing. Hi. And I was clapping by accident. I meant to raise my hand, but I'm giving you claps anyway. So I have more of like a comment and then another question, but I've been thinking about this a lot as it pertains to the content in my classrooms and in efforts to decolonize that content, how it challenges students that are bringing a certain comprehension of a discipline in a field, and how that could create conflict. So I've been doing a lot of work in trying to set up like really productive spaces of discussion. But what I like about how you're framing this is like what opportunity arises in those moments of conflict that could be leveraged towards like greater understanding and connection within that space. And so I'm like responding in a very small example, but I think in all of the work that we do, we can like build towards greater change, like in our respective spaces. So I just wanted to thank you for giving us that different framework. And it's a challenge to think about how to make those moments of conflict end up being productive spaces where we can actually end up coming together for moments of cultural and exchange. So that's all I was going to say.
Yes, cultural exchange. It's a moment where we can do some cultural exchange. And then Glenda.
Hi, y'all. I do have some construction going on at my house. I apologize if you hear some things going on. So I do think I wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Genevieve said. So the opportunity part is kind of what I was thinking. And that like, I think that the conflict is good also. And it makes many of us who didn't feel like we had, it gives us a different type of agency. Because right, that whole, there's strength in numbers. So I know that as I see more more people of color being hired and coming to work at my school, it does give me a little bit more agency in the sense that, there are more allies, there are more opportunities for us as a group to speak up. And so I think that the conflict is good, and it's helping push some folks into spaces that they didn't necessarily know they needed to be in. But now that there are more of us kind of bringing the issues to light or talking about some of these things, it does give us an agency that on our own, we didn't necessarily have before.
And then Ariel.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about conflict from the staff perspective. So we have, so I'm responsible for diversity education for residence life staff, and identifying what that curriculum looks like, and creating it and distributing it, and getting pushback. And I think of conflict in that way. There are some folks who are excited about it, learning new things, we're having dialogue, and other folks that are not as interested in participating and trying to figure out what accountability looks like for the different staff levels within our organization, because somebody has to cover the front desk, right? So yeah, conflict in that regard.
Yeah, it is, as noted, inclusion is not something, so we can mandate participation in a training or, but for the most part, inclusion is just not something that you can mandate. So it really is about structuring opportunities for interaction and teaching people the skills needed to enable supportive interaction. And that what we know is that it's repeated small interactions that kind of build those skills over time. So that increased diversity being associated with increased conflict. See if it'll move. So the first is noting that many institutions actually are responding to this increased conflict by shifting their language to be race inclusive in order to kind of hide the conflict. So where they respond by emphasizing similarities across racial and ethnic diversity and downplaying the lived reality of historical and contemporary differences. And the challenge is that, again, for historically marginalized students, it's that sense of, but no, we do have particular experiences of like different groups that matter, and kind of just using that, we can all come together as a multicultural institution, and all of us are kind of that, and all of us are experiencing the difficulty of belonging here does not work, of just kind of downplaying it and really kind of minimizing the fact that Black students in particular have a history, and a very visible history, and can be very visibly targeted on campus in ways that lead to experiences of inclusion. That doesn't work. And so the idea is, how can we use diversity conflict to spur self-reflection, perspective taking, and other aspects of interpersonal growth? So what happens is, as we increase diversity, we get more students on campus of different various groups, which is a prerequisite for creating the opportunity for the conflict that we can then, cultural conflict that we can learn from. But then we need to be able to have those conversations, like in a class, around identifying our biases. Why is kind of shifting to a particular set of readings experienced by some as kind of disbelief that, that these things are true, depending on what subject area, and then really needing to dig into the data. So it's really thinking, when we're thinking about our classes, how can we help students be kind of critical thinkers in terms of introducing a couple of controversial readings, in terms of readings that help us to rethink our historical understanding of things, or our historical understanding of who contributed to the science of any field, and then critically examining and breaking those down in classes. When that discussion happens in the class context, actually, it's often leads to greater cross-cultural interaction outside of the class context, because they've thought about it in kind of critical ways. But the other is that, so my institution, again, that I can use as an example, has done at times these really huge, to me, I think, huge leaps in trying to create inclusion by setting up these diversity dialogues, where they got invited faculty, staff, students to come into rooms in small groups of like 30 and have what they call like difficult and uncomfortable conversations. And for me, I was like, whoa, that's huge, that's big. Can we start with just small, regular, repeated, and many opportunities that are deliberately integrative across boundaries, so people can just learn some basic and small communication skills and interaction skills, and just learn culturally about other, before we try to get people in a room and have uncomfortable conversations. I attended one of those, kind of sat in the back of the room, and I was like, ooh, this is difficult. And what we know is that just coming together and having like this big, structured, uncomfortable conversation and then leave doesn't actually do much to increase diversity, because it's the learning, it's the meaningful learning about an interaction with the other over time that creates change. And so it's kind of this idea that, one, proximity is not enough. Just bringing kids to campus is not enough. But we have to create, in all the different spaces, in classroom spaces, in social group spaces, in extracurricular spaces, in kind of cultural awareness mini courses and opportunities for learning. It is that multiplicity of all of those different interactions and spaces that then creates the opportunity and shift changes on campus. And I'm just gonna list this kind of three. These were not created by me. These are out there. So it's kind of like, it's semi-formal facilitated events. So events that are structured either by the institution or student groups. They're semi-formal, you're inviting people, you're structuring it, but they're not huge, big, uncomfortable conversations. It's just cultural learning. Peer education that uses older students with diverse peer networks to educate incoming students of their same race or ethnicity. So this is really big. It's when we're trying to build people's comfort and capacity, doing these things within group, where they're learning from other students who know how to do this, that enables them to ask questions, have some conversations before throwing them into some kind of big cross-group, uncomfortable conversation, sharing of like experiences of discrimination event. And then lastly, just really quickly, I just want to note the integrative benefits of formal and informal exclusionary spaces. So counter spaces, what the book was all about was essentially the idea that historically marginalized students come to campus. One, let me tell you, they come to campus believing that they will experience that it's going to be different there. They come to campus believing that because that's what our recruitment tells them. So their initial approach to campus is one of, okay, I'm going to believe these folks. I'm going to believe that things are going to be different there. I'm going to believe that things have changed. And they come in very open. The challenge is that openness leaves them very vulnerable to stereotyping, discrimination, and alienation, and it hits them quite hard. And they then withdraw. And if they have counter spaces of some kind, where they are able to connect and engage with others of their same race and ethnicity, and talk about some of the experiences that they've had once they've gotten to campus, it can create a local place of belonging on campus that then enables them to move from that withdrawn space back into engaging with campus. We actually find that kids who experience the stereotyping, discrimination, and alienation in intense ways, when they engage in these segregated counter spaces of others like themselves, they actually end up engaging more with the institution over time. Students who don't have these counter spaces just withdraw into themselves and kind of begin to isolate and alienate themselves because they don't have those supports needed to problem solve and understand and develop coping skills in order to manage that demographic marginalization. So as I showed in the very beginning, particularly when you're looking at Black students in your campus, there's such a small percent of the campus. It means that almost all the time, they're going to feel demographic marginalization. So almost all the time, they're going to feel this kind of singled out, like I'm a representative of my group in this class, in this space, in this club, and that wears on you over time. Encounter spaces enables them to kind of relax from that. And when they have those spaces, they actually engage more in the institution over time. So I'm going to stop there and see if in these, because I know many of you have to go in these last couple of minutes, if there's any other big pressing questions from some of the stuff that we discussed that would be helpful.
There are some questions in the chat that I can just read out to give you a sense for some of the questions and comments. And so one question is, was segregation a default that supported exclusion and or lack of inclusion? Were efforts made to create and gender support cultural integration, intelligence, competency, or fluency? Another question is, in terms of the academic dimension of inclusion, how do we as a university encourage the decolonization of the curriculum? It seems like work has to be done in the departments by local experts, and yet, as you mentioned, there are places where we don't have volunteers stepping up to take on this work. And then I'll just give you one other comment. This is, we need to have in place alternative ways to resolve conflict, like restorative justice programs, so that members of diverse communities can listen and understand harm caused. Intentionality is important when you have more diversity.
Yes, fully agree with that one. Intentionality is critical. Let me just note with the curriculum, I would say really encouraging those curricular small, and on most campuses, they're fairly small, so they're not a huge, big budget item, but they can go a long way. Curricular improvement grants that enable faculty to hire and work with a graduate student in their department, for example, in order to diversify the range of scholars and cultural backgrounds and information in their syllabus along kind of many elements of diversity of voices that are in the course and curriculum. So doing a few of those kind of curricular grants in different departments and fields is one way to get that started, because oftentimes, faculty have that syllabus that they've been using since forever. And it really isn't updated as the range of scholars in a field have diversified. Also, yes, I will share the PowerPoint, and then I'm sure it'll be shared with all of you. I'm just looking at the other questions. Any other big question? If anybody wants to come off mute and ask? But then I also know that it's like 1 minute past, and I want to be able to enable Melissa to release you if you're trying to get someplace.
Yes, everyone should feel free to leave if they need, but I believe Dr. Keels is also willing to stay behind a little bit if anyone would like to engage more deeply. We are hoping to post this presentation on nbdiversity.rutgers.edu, so our campus-based DICE website. And so before we lose the majority of the group again, I want to thank Dr. Keels, but also let everyone know that she will be joining us again in February as a part of Access Week. And so again, thinking about how do we create those repeated, sustained conversations with scholars who are doing this work, this is an effort at that. And so just want to thank you, Dr. Keels, for creating such a thoughtful and engaging presentation, allowing people to jump in the middle, posing questions to us. Thank you for pushing us on how we think about conflict as well. And so again, if you need to drop off, feel free. But if you have questions and want to stay behind a little bit, we also have a few more minutes to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keels. So I'm thinking about so many things and have so many, I wish I had you for like a whole conference. So definitely gonna wanna read some more, but wondering about, a lot of what you said definitely resonates. I work in our Cultural Center Collaborative at our Latino Center here at Rutgers. And a lot of this work, when we are needing to be intentional, right? When we are trying to shift minds. So some advice on how do we do this when the reality is when I do this kind of work with my students and do peer education, it takes more time. It takes intentionality from students that are already student leaders, are already marginalized, are already, so we're both using staff and students that are part of the marginalized group to educate the rest of the community. And I know that that needs to happen, right? Like we need to come together. But the reality is that sometimes when it comes to like thinking through doing these work, a lot of us have all these other things that we're doing, right? So how do we convince ourselves, our colleagues, across division, across, student affairs and academic affairs, and really, think about the reality is that the intentionality that we need needs to come from funding, and we need to restructure how we are doing the work and what we kind of do traditionally. So I'm sorry for my ramble, but that's where I am right now with all your wonderful knowledge. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear your thoughts.
That's basically like the time and resources question, right? Do I have that? Is that correct?
Yes, but it's also like, it's beyond that. It's like a lot of us know that, right? I feel like most of us in this conversation are aware of that, but it's also about, suggestions on how to like help shift and also creatively uplift so that there's a balance. So making it more complicated.
Yeah, I would say, so I also do K-12 work. And one of the things that I always say in that space is one of the best ways to get change happening, and my K-12 work is mental health. student mental health. And one of the best ways to get schools to do student mental health work is to connect it to something that they are already being held accountable for. And so I would say the same thing in this space. In whichever office or agency, whatever accountability metrics they are trying to meet, it's how can we think about the work that we're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? How can it help them advance that accountability metric? So to me, it's the persistence one. You know, these things, one of the direct outcomes of them is increasing the persistence of students from historically marginalized groups when this work is done, and helping those offices to see that you actually, the other piece is it does two things. It helps persistence, and then that persistence itself helps with recruitment. Because one of the things that many institutions do when they're trying to recruit is that they have to try to find those historically marginalized students that are on their campus that can assist with recruitment efforts. And the more students that are having a successful experience on your campus, the more students that you have to help to facilitate recruitment of other students as they are coming in. So that is one of those big ways. And actually the way that I did it, I added that in, knowing that, I added that into our campus climate survey. And the survey to students, it had, I think, 2 or 3 questions about this. And one of the questions is, do you actively promote this institution to high school students who are trying to figure out where to go? Have you actively discouraged students that the institution has tried to recruit from coming to this institution? They were worded a little bit better than that, but those were 2 of them. And what they found, what it showed, was that students from historically marginalized groups were less likely to support the recruiting of high school students, and more likely to actively discourage students from coming to this institution. And so again, I put that in there because I wanted to communicate to the institution that ensuring that students have a successful experience in campus is going to help with these other efforts that you're trying to do. So that is, so trying to find like, what are those accountability metrics that matter to the institution that they're paying attention to? And how can the diversity and inclusion support those metrics?
We'll officially end at 15 after. And so any final questions, comments? Dr. Keels, would you like to leave us with a final thought?
Final thoughts. I'm not good with those. I usually have too many thoughts. Really, my final thought is just that you guys are doing the hard work. This work is not easy, especially in this moment when there's so many stressors. There's so many stressors going on. And I know that you guys are getting emails and phone calls and text messages, weekdays, evenings, and weekends. And so I think my final thought really is and I had this yesterday, dialogue back and forth with a colleague, which is just, it's actually the space of, if we aren't taking care of ourselves, then we can't give others and our students the support that they need. And I see it from a very small perspective because, it's only the students in my classroom. my college class that I have to deal with. And I already had a couple so far this year, that distressing events and things going on. And to be able to like show up for those students day after day and problem solve with them and do all of that work, you know, it's a space that I commend you guys. And I know that it is exhausting work. And so taking care of yourselves also, so that we are in November. We've got a long way to go to get to the end of the year, and things are going to come up. You know, they're going to be challenges that are going to come up that we don't expect yet. And in order to be able to kind of show up and meet those challenges as they come, that we got to take care of ourselves also. So that, and I'm looking forward to the kind of workshop and conversation and work with you guys again in a few months.
Well, again, thank you so much. And again, just really appreciate how you opened up the space and welcome people into your presentation and welcome people into the knowledge that you bring. And so just really appreciated being with you in this space.
Thank you guys. It was a pleasure. Looking forward to the next one.
And thank you everyone for hanging in there. Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.